So this is the moment when I can start the meeting officially. It's so great to welcome you, Kevin Hawkins, in our very special MLE Friends and CC Community of Contemplative Education talk today at Mind and Life Europe. My name is Gabor Kaisai. I'm the Managing Director of MLE. As you know, this series of talks are special in the sense that we hear from experts of the network of the community on a more personal basis in an exclusive setting. So we only have the chance to enter into dialogue in this very moment, in this very situation, while being together. It's really special today that we have the opportunity to hear from Kevin Hawkins after the publication of his and Amy Burke's second book. I will share a little information about that book in a minute. But first of all, I would like to introduce Kevin himself. You may know him very well, but those who may not know him, it would be meaningful to hear about his background, of course. Kevin has worked with adolescents and young people in various contexts for over 40 years now, as a teacher, school head, and social worker in the UK, Africa, and Europe. For 10 years, he was middle school principal at the International School of Prague in the Czech Republic. He is a senior lead trainer for the Mindfulness in Schools Project UK and has taught mindfulness to children, teenagers, teachers, and parents since 2008. In 2012, he co-founded MindWell, which supports educational communities in developing well-being through mindfulness and social emotional learning. He is a facilitator for the evidence-based care program, Cultivating Awareness and Resilience in Educators, to be precise. Kevin is a regular speaker, writer, and presenter on the topics of mindfulness, well-being, and social emotional learning in education. His first book on mindfulness in education, titled Mindful Teacher, Mindful School, Improving Well-being in Teaching and Learning, was published in July 2017 and was co-written with Amy Burke. And his second book, The Mindful Teacher's Toolkit, Awareness-Based Well-being in Schools, has just been published this October, actually a week ago, as I have just mentioned. So it's quite new. And the title of today's webinar is Awareness-Based Well-being in Schools, Empowering Educators. And I won't read the questions that you highlighted, Kevin, in the preliminary communication of this talk, because you will talk about those questions yourself during the webinar. And thank you again for coming and giving us the opportunity to learn from you about such a hot topic and about your book, which is just so fresh and new that we will be probably the first ones to hear about it after its publication. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabor, for that lovely introduction. Yes, I mean, we're very excited because it just is in our hands now, only from a few days ago. So it just arrived here in Spain, and it's exciting to finally have that book ready and to look at it. Yeah, very, very pleased to see it. And very much a joint effort with Amy and myself, but also with a colleague in the States, Kristen Fort-Catanese, who wrote the section on early years for that as well. So very happy to be here, and some people I recognize and haven't seen for a while, so that's lovely, and some people I haven't met before. That's nice too. And I'm going to try and structure this talk presentation. So I'll talk for a bit and set the scene for you a little bit about awareness-based well-being, about bringing mindfulness and social emotional learning into our school systems, and also about empowering teachers, because we see in all of our work that we've been doing, as many of you are doing too, that it's really the teachers that need the empowerment in order to empower the students. And so I'll be focusing on that as well as we go through. I really want to set it up so that there'll be space for questions and comments. And I intend to also leave towards the end, a question for this group here, but also perhaps a wider question for the Mind Life community about how we can support further these moves to bring greater consciousness really into teaching and learning. So, I mean, this is really a time when educators are feeling disempowered and disillusioned. Many educators around the world, certainly many that we're in touch with these days. And there are record numbers, as you will know, leaving the profession in many countries, leaving very early. And I want to start off looking at the bigger picture of the context that we're all working in. And not that I expect any of that to be new to any of you, but I also wanted to share with you a little bit the ways that we would introduce this to educators as well, when we're bringing this subject to them, which is not just about can we add a little bit of mindfulness into your teaching or learning. It's really about can we begin to shift the focus of education in quite a deep way, as so many people are looking at these days. Really trying to find ways that we can make teaching and learning more meaningful, especially in these challenging times. And when we're looking at teachers and their own self-care and their own well-being, it's partly because we obviously want to empower teachers to sustain themselves in a very demanding career. But it's also, isn't it, because we want to empower them to create the most optimal learning environment for their students, for the young people that they nurture, especially at this time of global challenge, which we're all experiencing. So refocusing education in order to get us closer so that some of those deeper qualities and values that we may hold dear become more and more a part of a child's and a teacher's everyday experience of being in a school, kind of really refocusing on what really matters in education. So I have some slides that I'm going to share with you and some images just to support a little bit what I'm saying here. And it's not news anymore, is it, that the global pandemic is causing massive suffering all around the world. And although we may be getting very tired of having to cope with it and having to talk about it, it's still here. And in many countries, this disruption that it's brought has really highlighted the stress and strains that especially that our public health and education systems are under these days. That even before COVID, these systems have been creaking at the seams in many ways. We see this in the impact on our health workers, but also on our teachers as well. And I guess in some ways, especially at the beginning, the lockdown did bring home to parents the importance of being able to send their children to school every day. I mean, partly so they can get on with their own work, but also an understanding of how difficult it is actually to manage the learning of young people and keep them motivated and engaged as well. And it's still, though, isn't it, a time of uncertainty for students and for teachers. Uncertainty breeds anxiety. The mind doesn't like to not know what's going to be happening next, how we're going to be teaching and how we're going to be learning. And that state in many countries is still continuing today. And the pandemic has also obviously greatly increased the stress on health workers and on teachers. This was just a word cloud from quite a big survey we did of international school counsellors a few months into the pandemic. How are you feeling? You know, how are you feeling now? And of course, there are some people who are relieved to be home more or to be working in a different way, or grateful for having good health, but also a lot of anxiety and uncertainty, and above all, really a sense of overwhelm. I mean, for so many people, not just teachers, but this sense of this being both a professional and a personal crisis. So having to manage my own children as well as my students, having to manage concerns about my own health as well as my family's health, and deal with safety and health at school as well, really has added to the burdens of teachers. And I don't know if you've seen this, but this is a short video I'll just share with you that was on a Canadian news program. So it's about one teacher who decided to try and make a little song about how things have been going since the pandemic started and how that's increased the burden on teachers to a degree.
All right, as much of the world continues on in isolation, people working from home, they're trying to figure out things to do with their family, things to figure out how to pass the time. Yeah. Lindsay and Kels, a lot of teachers have been going online and coaches trying to help out their students and their athletes. This one teacher in particular, music teacher, I thought was phenomenal. Not only did she pick up an instrument and decide to help out her student and spread some joy, but she wrote a song, and as inspiration, she was going to share what she's been going through and how it makes her feel while she is in isolation. Have a look.
Hey, so as some of you guys might know, I'm a music teacher, and I found that one of the best ways that I can process the whole transition to online learning and teaching is to write a song. So I wrote a song. I'd like to share that with you guys now. Here we go.
Well, it takes him a while to recover from that, but I think she said it very well on behalf of many of us. That's kind of summed it up. That's probably how a lot of us have been feeling, teaching and being a parent through this difficult time. So,
all right, as much as
it's also, though, hasn't it, in many ways opened up the door to have the kind of conversation that we're having this evening. And in many other places, there's all sorts of groups that have come together and areas which have really taken further a movement that was already happening in questioning in a deeper way how we can reimagine and reshape or reform and rethink education. So this disruption in some ways has created possibilities for us to rethink, not least because one of the kind of reasons we always say we can't change anything in education is because of the school schedule or these other pragmatic bits that control the way that we teach. But suddenly there was no schedule overnight. It had to be completely rethought. So the impossible in a way became possible for a while. And as in so many areas of life, there's been so much talk in education about not going back to normal, that there is so much that we've questioned about normality, that this is really opening up that door to question it further still. And some of the research that was done during the early months of the pandemic highlighted in educational circles where the attention of school leaders and teachers and the community was going to. And in many of these, we saw that social emotional learning and obviously health came out as something that was really rising to the top of concerns for schools. And this is something that we've been wanting to happen, not through a disaster, of course, but to highlight these needs for a long time. So this door that's been opened a little bit, we need to keep pushing on in a way to make sure that we maximize the opportunities to keep this focus on social and emotional aspects of learning. And of course, the understanding of the EQ as compared to the IQ has been growing, for 2 or 3 decades now, and has begun to impact a little bit in education. The imbalance that we see in schools in the ways that we decide on what is the content, what's appropriate to be taught in our school curricula. And our schools reflect, don't they, in many ways, the imbalance also that we see in the world around us. And in some ways, we can see that as an imbalance of heart and mind. Because there's no doubt, is there, that as a species, human beings are extraordinarily clever. The technological capacity that we have to send a rover and land it gently on the surface of the planet Mars is extraordinary. We are no doubt a very clever species, but we are not so clever when it comes to sharing the planet with each other. And we're not so clever, are we, when it comes to sharing the planet with other species? And just last week in China, there was a COP meeting on the threat to biodiversity, which has become a huge problem again in recent times, such large numbers of species that are crucially under threat or even already extinct because of the impact of humans on the planet. And of course, the biggest concern of all at the moment in terms of global warming, the Paris Agreement seems to be a long time ago now, and at that time there was some celebration that an agreement had been reached. But meanwhile, there hasn't been a lot of action. And while people talk, leaders talk, still we see the planet in places burning and sinking in different ways. And so we've had really thrust into the front of our agenda in recent decade, and then for many people just in the last few years, the understanding of the fragility of our planet, that human existence on the planet has a much more fragile edge than we'd ever really contemplated before. And it's also true that the planet will soon be in the hands of the young people that we are concerned with educating in our schools, in our homes right now. And the Dalai Lama summed this up very beautifully in this phrase, that having a smart brain is not enough. We also need a warm heart. So this imbalance of heart and mind in our society, and it's also reflected in some ways, perpetuated through our educational systems, is really about a way of valuing cleverness, but not really understanding how we cultivate wisdom. And it's this that we're referring to when we're talking about refocusing our education systems. There are young people who are wise as well as clever, and we need to find ways to really support school cultures to really produce more young people who are wise as well as clever. And this idea that at the moment it becomes increasingly important within our education systems to make understanding ourselves a central part of our school systems, so that they really do become centers for human development. And this idea of understanding how my mind, body, and feelings work, how they work together, how they can sometimes trip me up in life. This is a really important thing for humans to learn and understand as they grow. It's a central life skill. And if we really want to help develop the whole child and to be able to see her grow, to be able to maximize her potential in all different areas, and also to be able to creatively and collaboratively work with her peers to face some of these complex challenges in the future, then we need an education system that draws on the full range of human capacities, not just some narrow range that for historical reasons we've decided is the job of school. But as you know, schools are not particularly good historically at doing that. We're much more comfortable in educational institutions with the analytical and critical skills than we are with the social, emotional, even some of the creative areas have been lost in some areas of schooling in recent years as well. But if we do want to have a generation of young people who are going to mature in ways that are wise as well as clever, that are healthy and well, then we need to pay attention to these areas of not just physical, but also mental and social emotional health and well-being as well. And it's not easy to do this. There are so many concerns amongst young people these days, causes of anxiety. I mean, even before COVID, we were all aware in education, especially of the growing numbers of children with mental health issues, especially anxiety and depression. And that's only been exacerbated over the past 2 years. And this study came out recently about 3 and 4 young people thinking of the future as frightening. So our kids, when we talk about consciousness and waking up and being aware, in some ways our kids are often, many of them are very awake and aware about many of the problems in the world at the moment. They can't not see it because it's around them all the time. Especially climate change, I think. It's becoming a worry for many children. So it's important that schools are able to deal with these issues. It's very important. But it's also important that schools are places of learning where children feel safe and where they can learn about these difficult issues in an age-appropriate way, and also have a sense of confidence and optimism and hope for the future as they grow the skills and qualities that they need to collaborate in the way that I'm describing as they become adults. But it's actually very hard to provide that kind of an atmosphere when the adults in the room themselves are also feeling highly stressed and uncertain. And we know from so many countries, this just came out in the summer in the UK, yet another story of the numbers of teachers suffering from emotional burnout more than anything, and that leading them to leave the profession very early. And we often refer to this lovely quote by Chris Willard that the best way to create stressed out kids is to surround them with stressed out adults. But Chris is also careful to point out that the best way to create caring, calm, and compassionate kids is to surround them with caring, calm, and compassionate adults. It's not an easy time to be a calm adult in schools at the moment, but it is something that we need to focus upon for ourselves and for our young people. Because in many ways, as a child is a natural organism and grows, it needs sunlight and it needs earth and it needs water and air, just as a plant does, just as we all do. And in many ways, the soil for a plant to grow is the family and the adults that connect with that child on a daily basis. And just as a farmer doesn't go into the fields at night and tug on a plant to make it grow, a farmer concentrates on the conditions that will help those plants to grow. And so it's the conditions that surround our children that are needing our attention also at the moment. What is the quality and the state of mind and the presence of the adults in their lives at the moment? We do believe, as many of you I know are already working in this area in very skillful ways, that there are ways to bring this sense of self-care and embodiment of deeper qualities and presence to our teachers and to our students. So in the training that we do, and the way we organize it, as many mindfulness and social emotional learning organizations do, we focus first and foremost on helping educators to become more mindful, or to become more socially, emotionally competent, or to become more aware. And this has the impact of changing the way that they are in their relationships at work, and the way that they teach and connect with colleagues and with young people. And then some people then will be trained by us and by other organizations to go on to teach mindfulness to students. Unfortunately, quite often, mindfulness is everywhere these days, and some teachers understandably jump in at the bottom end, like teaching mindfulness to kids without doing anything for themselves. And that is something that doesn't often work for very long if we want to have that deeper impact on our learners. So we come back to this foundation of being mindful and how this helps us to teach mindfully. And in the courses that we do, we really set this out for young educators. How can we first go into this area in depth of becoming mindful, and then learning to teach more mindfully, observing and noticing how that happens, and then bringing it to students when we really feel ready to do so. And there's a number of programs that really help this in teachers. This one, the CARE program, was inspired originally by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And it's Amy and I, we are both trainers for teachers on this program. But at the moment, we're involved in a research project with teachers in Chicago who are going through this training as well. Cultivating awareness and resilience in education. It's just a 3-day program, but it's been quite robustly researched. This trial was done a while ago in New York City with primary school teachers. And there was a very measurable impact through medical, physiological measures and through doctors' reports of a decrease in stress symptoms on the teachers that took the training. There was an increase in emotional regulation. Teachers felt a decreased sense of time pressure, which is quite special if you think about it. So the teachers in the control group had a higher sense of time pressure. Those that had done the 3-day training somehow felt they had a bit more time in the day, which is something we all really would be grateful for. But interestingly, there was also an impact in the classroom, even though none of the training was about classroom practice directly. There was a measurable increase in the way that students felt supported or were supported emotionally. And there was even an increase in classroom organization. They measured in terms of productivity within the classroom. There was a notable increase in those classes. And I haven't got time to go into a lot of depth here, but in our first book, Mindful Teacher, Mindful School, there's a lot more information on these areas of being mindful and teaching mindfully. And actually, I did do another half-hour recording for Mind Life through the CCE, which is available as a video as well. So I won't go into so much detail into the teaching mindfully area, even though that is a kind of a crucial area that we find really helps teachers to develop their skills. And the other book we're talking about that's just arrived, if you're interested in some of the bigger ideas I'm talking about this evening, the introduction and the conclusion focus very much on this context and this ideas of educational change. And then the rest of the book is very much a practical guide for teachers on bringing mindfulness and social emotional learning activities to different age groups in different ways. And of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has also had influence in getting the Sea Learning project from Emory University off the ground. A beautiful project that's providing wonderful materials for teachers of students at different age groups that really find skillful ways of enhancing and cultivating social and emotional skills and ethical learning, using mindful awareness training in parts of that to really promote those areas too. And as this quote says, the time for social, emotional, and ethical learning has truly come. And we can see signs of that all around the world right now. And in the terms of the way that we define this within Mindwell, we see mindful awareness training as the skills that we do with teachers that they can then pass on to their students when they're trained to do so, combined with social emotional learning. That when we bring these two areas together, that we get really an increase in consciousness in the classroom, both for the teachers and for the students. And we call this awareness-based well-being, because it promotes well-being for the whole school community. You can see how the mindfulness training can support those key social emotional competencies. Here we're using the Castle definition of those: self-management and self-awareness, those internal skills, and social awareness and relationship skills, those external skills, and then how that affects the way that we behave and make decisions in our lives. So this is a powerful combination, not just for the children, but also for the adults in the building, and that we can hold ourselves accountable to the same standards that in these areas we want our children to develop. So what we want for our children, we really need it for ourselves as well. And this awareness we're looking at here in terms of promoting well-being through raising consciousness, of course, begins with awareness of self, but then, of course, it also incorporates a lot of awareness of our relationships with others that are close to us that we know, but also understanding others that are further away that we don't know, in different places, in different cultures. And it's also, isn't it, an awareness in the end about understanding our place in the world and how the world functions around us, understanding the environment and understanding how systems work, our nervous system, our emotional system, our physical system, but also the ecosystem and the system within a school and a learning place. Because if we want to change some of these systems, then it's also important to understand how they function. So awareness, raising consciousness, for us is the key to building empowerment in teachers that can then build greater empowerment in our students. And as Eckhart Tolle said, awareness is the greatest agent for change. So unless we understand something, we can't really change it. And if we look at some of the beautiful initiatives that are coming out of systems thinking these days, I've been involved in a few from MIT, the Presencing Institute and Gaia Institute. Many of these initiatives and the work of Peter Senge, they are often now, in terms of leadership and change, coming back to, first of all, working with an individual and then a collective mindful awareness in focusing in this area, that we can't really bring change unless we can, within a system, unless we can see ourselves within that system. So bringing back the beam of observation of systems thinking onto ourselves as well. And we want to use this beam of observation, this lens, if you like, in a way that we really want to encourage not just educators, but also our school leaders, essentially, to increasingly be able to see through this lens of well-being. And not just school leaders, but especially policymakers. How can we widen the circle of people who are beginning to understand the value, the deep value of seeing well-being as a primary target? We see it, don't we, in some ways, sometimes in some countries these days, even on a governmental level. If we look at the budget that New Zealand set, or I think Iceland has worked in this way, and Finland too, and of course Bhutan originally, looking at overall well-being as being more important than overall economic development. And so there are movements within the world that really promote the idea of measuring what we value, not valuing what we measure. And we need this to filter into our approaches to schools and into learning. And it's really important these days to have conversations with students and teachers about what are we doing in school? What is the deeper driving purpose of our school systems? This is actually the last year that I was teaching in the international school in Prague. So these were the student and teachers group there. And we would create situations sometimes with students as well, and in our staff meetings, where we would go a little bit more deeply into what are we doing in a school? You know, I'd say to them sometimes, when you think about it, a school, it's really just a bunch of kids and adults in a building, really, fundamentally. And when we see it that way, then the question becomes, how can we best spend our time together? And we need to ask those deeper questions about prioritizing things, because school is so busy. Teachers are really overwhelmed with different initiatives and things they have to do. There is so much that distracts away from the fundamentals of teaching and learning, and the reason that people came in to become teachers in the first place. So can we bring ourselves back to reassess what we're doing here on a daily basis, to ask these deeper questions about what really matters in schools? And to ask that question, we often ask parent audiences especially, but also teachers. And I'm going to ask you now as well this same question about what it is that we really want for our young people. So if I could ask you for a moment to bring to mind a child. It could be a child of your own, if you have one. It could be a relative, a nephew or niece, or a grandchild. It could be a child that you teach, or it could be any child. But just a child you can get an image of clearly in your mind for a moment. So just bring that child to mind. And then just notice what comes up for you when I ask the question, what do you want for this child in life? And you may have lots of different ideas coming up, but see if you can just let one word or phrase bubble up to the top, and I'll ask you again. What is it that you really, really want for this child? So what do we want for our children? Could you just call out or put in the chat a word or phrase that occurred to you in that moment? Okay, so thank you. So from Amy, peace of mind, and Bruce, happiness, and Gabor, also happiness, and Amy Burke, good health and happiness. From Mark, recognizing their true nature, their basic goodness. Yeah, happiness, a sense of wonder and awe, purpose in life, and happiness again. And David, to be nurtured, cared for, encouraged, inspired, and enabled. That could be a school mission statement right there. So beautiful. And happiness again. Yeah, it's such a key area. Thank you so much for sharing those. And you know, I'm going to share my screen again because in many ways, it's not a surprise that this group here this evening would come up with those deeper, beautiful qualities. But actually, what we found in doing this in so many places around the world with very different parent groups and teacher groups in different cultures, different levels of economic security as well, that these same areas come through. This actually list is from the very first time we ever did it with a parent group many years ago. So of course happiness is in there, and those other areas that you were talking about, health and well-being, and you've added some beautiful ones to that list as well. So when we ask parents these questions, they seldom say, I want my kid to get the highest grades and go to Harvard. I mean, they might be saying that to their teachers every day and to their kids, but on a heart level, on a deeper level, these are really universal values, aren't they? That we really, I mean, the priority could be culturally influenced, but in general, there's a range here of deeper human qualities and values that we really want for our children, and we want for our society and for our planet. So how can we find ways to help education on a daily level get closer to really furthering these areas? And you know, it comes back, doesn't it, in many ways to the connection between teacher and student. That's where I want to leave us towards the end here now, really. And I think, you know, education generally is valued pretty highly around the world, but education is valued highly, and sometimes in the same countries, educators are valued less highly. And in some schools, teachers don't feel very highly valued. And sometimes we as teachers don't value ourselves very highly. But our work is crucially important. We are really sculpting the brains of the next generation in many ways, along with in partnership with parents. And it's such an important job that it needs to be explicitly and articulately valued by parents, but by also education policy leaders in our countries as well. And when we talk about what really matters, so many teachers become dismayed by the burden of things that they have to do that detract in some ways from the essence of what they thought was important in teaching. And we need to clear away some of that clutter so that we can open up the space to really let teachers do what really is important, which is to connect with our students, to put relationship at the heart of learning, and to empower them to really carve out that space and focus on it so that they can bring their enthusiasm and their expertise in ways that really helps to develop their children. And we want them to be able to take care of themselves, because care is such an important thing. And you hear that self-care term bandied about so often these days, sometimes trivialized in a way, but it's not, when we're talking about self-care, it's not just about having a regular bubble bath or something like that. Those might be helpful, but it's really about mental and emotional health, taking that seriously and taking care of ourselves. And it can't feel like just another thing that a teacher has to do in order to be able to survive and function in a difficult environment. It has to become part and parcel of how we see well-being as woven into our educational systems, one of the key drivers, along with academic achievement, of our educational systems. So as educators, we see this shifting the focus to start, first of all, in this understanding of ourselves. It then begins to impact our teaching and our students, and then in our schools and our school systems as well. And I want to end with this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, which is quite famous now. Happy teachers will change the world, he said. And when I first heard that, I thought, I don't know, teachers can't really be happy all the time. It's such a demanding job. But now I really feel more connected with this statement, because we do have the power in education to impact the world. And education works best when we are well, or as well as we can be, when we're taking care of ourselves. And when we do that as educators, we are modeling care for our students, showing them that self-care is important. And we're also helping them to learn to take care of themselves and to take care of each other. And if ever there's been a time when we needed a young generation of young people who are equipped and engaged and ready to also take care of our planet, then this surely has to be it right now. So that's as much information or ideas that I really want to put to you at this stage. So I'm going to open up in a moment for questions and for your own input. But I did want to just float this question as well. I deliberately haven't put my perspective on this into the talk yet, but I'm very happy to discuss this with you. Is, what role can Mind and Life community continue to play? Because there's already quite a lot being done in taking practical steps to help support this growth of consciousness and awareness in our schools. So I want to pass that over to you, but for now I'm going to stop my share and hand this back to Gabor.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this really inspiring talk. I would like to invite now our friends present here to start thinking about any questions you may have, and please feel free to raise your hand and share the question live, orally. You would not need to put it in the chat because we are a close, intimate community here. And while you are thinking and indicating your interest in raising a question, I would have one question, Kevin. You were highlighting the serious issues, especially the climate crisis that the young generation and all humanity are facing right now, and the stress and the anxiety coming with it, and the need for building some form of resilience in our minds. And we could, on the other hand, see in this little exercise that we try to emphasize as parents, that we would like our children to be happy, to find purpose in life, to develop a sense of wonder and awe, to recognize their true nature and basic goodness. And if we compare these two, the grim reality and the challenges that our children are facing, on the other hand, the need for happiness and the parents' wish for their children to be happy, how one can reconcile these two quite distinct or distant characters of our realities right now, the negative situation we face and the positivity we are looking for in teaching our children.
Yeah, that's so key, isn't it? And it's so key that as parents and as teachers, we can find ways within ourselves to face honestly the anxiety that we're dealing with, but also to bring with it our own hope and optimism and confidence as well. And in some ways, I think those two things kind of fit together pretty well, because if ever there was a statement for a school, for the next 50 years, we got it down to one mission statement, one sentence. For me, it would be something like, the purpose of this school that we're here together is to help ourselves learn how to share the planet within the context of this community. And a lot of learning can stem from that, connections and relationships, geography, history, and mathematics. So there's a huge purpose that needs to be met. And there is also the possibility of young people growing up and beginning to have an impact in that way. And as long as it's done in a careful way, not a burdensome way, we have a huge purpose for young people to be finding their way into contributing to a sustainable planet. And young people love to talk about this stuff. I mean, the picture of Greta Thunberg and what she's done since she was a young child, It's beautiful. There were some children in Melbourne in Australia. Nobody knew during the lockdown, but during the COVID statistics, three young 13 to 14-year-old boys produced a website that tracked all the important data about COVID around Australia and internationally, and allowed other people to use it. Now, government organizations were using their website without knowing it was a bunch of three teenagers who'd created it. So when you give kids the space and the opportunity, they can engage with these areas in creative and meaningful ways. I don't know about you, but for me, when I'm anxious about something, instead of it just being a problem I keep hearing about, if I can begin to take a small step, a practical step towards that immediately reduces my anxiety on some level. So feeling a sense of engagement and local community solidarity in working together to deal with difficult problems, I think humans are very good at that. I think it often brings out the best in us.
Thanks, Kevin. Yes, Mark, please.
I try. Working myself with the For Future movement in Germany. I'm myself an educator in schools and university. And the German system and structure is actually on the verge of really fundamentally changing because of the civic engagement. And my question tonight is two-sided. But one thing is really looking at what is really awareness-based education, because sometimes I have the impression it's kind of mindfulness-based, and also to consider compassion with Tanya Singer, her contribution to that, because there's really crucial findings in her research, which is very relevant, and she's engaging very strongly in Germany in education. My question would be, Kevin, with all your experience on this system levels, and you mentioned the CEU, how much experience or do you know about simulations of the new? Because my experience is that school is very hierarchical. And to make system change like Otto Scharmer, you need to experience the new in order to have the strength, the inner courage to make these decisions, to live the new. And the school head of schools, you mentioned them, there's a lot of pressure on them legally. So what your suggestions would be from your side to give them the experience that they can hold this change system, the system change?
That's a great question, Mark. And I mean, wonderful to hear that in some ways there is beginning to be a change within German areas because of this civic engagement in some ways, but also an awareness that things are very rigid, especially education. It's very hard to change education systems. And I know within Germany, there are, it's quite prescriptive, isn't it? What can and can't be taught within schools in a sense. So what I see from what is beginning to happen, I mean, from my own experience on a small level, I have tried with the staff teams applying some of those systems thinking approaches to understanding what is wanting to emerge within a school system at a certain time, and seeing if that can impact the way that we organize learning. And I found it very powerful. In fact, the most powerful thing that was able to change the culture of the schools that I've worked in was when we got together and worked on in that way of applying systems thinking to our school processes. So I know it can have an impact in quite a deep way. I described that in the first book that I wrote. But I also see it beginning to happen in other areas. I know through Otto Scharmer's work and through Gaia. I saw just recently an example in South Africa where systems thinking approach has been brought to a whole education service in an effort to try and change that. And we put something in our second book from Amsterdam as well, where systems thinking was applied amongst a group of schools in Amsterdam who were dealing with very difficult circumstances without much room for maneuver at all. And it didn't revolutionize the school system overnight, but it did begin to shift the culture, especially the parent-teacher relationships within that local community, and the understanding of the teachers of the processes of the difficulties that the leaders were facing as well. So that coming together and having a deeper dialogue, I think that is the thing that begins to shift. If we can begin to speak, use protocols and speak and listen in a more careful, attentive way to each other, that dialogue begins to grow and grow. And then we're looking, I think, then for some kind of tipping point where we've got a lot of different organizations and networks happening around the planet at this moment, looking to reimagine education. It's not a new thing anymore. It's actually out there everywhere. So the more those come together and overlap, and the more people hear this over and over, then we have a chance that people are becoming more open to change. Did you want to come back on that, Mark, for a moment?
I would like, David, if you're okay, I would just like a direct remark on that, because having got to know the teachers, I see that they are so much tied up in focus on topics. That whole training is on that, and they're actually, in my experience, afraid of relationship. Although the Hattie study clearly makes it, but they're not equipped according to their training up to now.
Yeah.
What we experience is actually that empower the students and allowing teachers to experience the new with the students. It's a leverage effect. It's like it's a kind of mutual learning and a surrendering of the teachers. And this needs like a protocol from politicians and administration, that actually the findings that, again, Tanya Singer and others who showed how important relationship is, and allowing teachers to take off the burden and just allowing students to manifest and hold this social emotional learning experience in a new way. And also mentioning briefly, the COVID brought a new importance on the online learning. So self-facilitated, self-organized learning. And the Minded Life has such a treasure of knowledge to support this shift, this crucial shift. So I want to ask you, is this like with the system thinking, is there a possibility with all your experience worldwide where we can not only dialogue, but actually mapping out, like giving a mind map for people where they could engage?
Yeah.
Do you have something like that?
I mean, the Gaia, have you seen the Gaia initiative, Mark, that happened last year? Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing. But I also wonder if Mind Life could play a role, maybe it is already, in helping to network networks. You know, that there are so many, I showed the Salzburg Forum and the WISE Education Reimagined. There's a lot of similarity in some of these areas, a lot of overlaps, but there's not a lot of networking between the networks at the moment. So that's one level that I think it needs greater facilitation and support. And on the other level, it's more for teachers individually. How can we help them? How can we provide them with what they need in order to access these kind of things? We can talk more about that if other people have ideas, but it's one thing to have a website and a network, but actually, how do teachers get that information? How do they get supported in that? So it has to come back in the end, doesn't it, to professional development, in-service training, and especially pre-service education for teachers. That if we can begin to impact those areas, that's where you can begin to see some change on that level. So you're talking from growing it up from the kids and empowering, but also when we've got a rigid system, what begins to give in that? And if you look at the example of Wales, you know, in the United Kingdom, countries don't review their national curriculum very often. You know, it takes quite a few decades to do that every now and then. But Wales have recently done that. And because of the work that was happening in Wales on the ground with individual teachers and interest in mindfulness and social emotional learning, when they came to do this review recently, they've managed to make well-being one of the 6 key areas of education for the whole of Wales for all children. So it's now becoming formalized, and mindfulness will play a role in that as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the question and for the answer, Kevin. David. We can't hear you yet.
Sorry,
No,
forgot to
that's
unmute.
good.
Thanks, Kevin. I'd like to follow Mark and ask Kevin to share something from his experience. And I'm going to use a phrase that Kevin himself used a minute ago, and that is tipping point. Kevin, you've described two different approaches that you use in your work. One could be your work in promoting an awareness-based approach to social and emotional and ethical education and learning. One of those approaches could be described as a bottom-up approach. And an example of that, which is fairly common, is that a teacher is interested in or is passionate about mindfulness and learns about mindfulness and develops a mindfulness practice, and then does a training to teach mindfulness in the classroom and teaches mindfulness to her students. And then she influences the environment, the learning environment, which is her classroom. So that's kind of like a bottom-up approach, starting with one single teacher and group of students and one classroom. And then you've described how you also use a top-down approach where you're working with school principals to develop a school-wide approach to awareness-based education. And so the principal is encouraging other staff to develop such approach and to develop certain pedagogies. And my question is, I wonder if in your experience there comes a tipping point whereby a school has developed this work so far that it's highly sustainable, that it's deeply embedded, that it's very evident and visible, and it's visible in many, maybe all aspects of the school and life in the school and the community.
Yeah, that's a great question, David, and thanks for asking that. And that, what we call those teachers, the teacher describing her, a champion teacher, you know, somebody who's championing this cause and perhaps working on their own, quite isolated for a while. Maybe there's one other person, maybe not. And what tends to happen if they don't get support at a certain point, then that will go with a teacher somewhere else, or it'll fizzle out. It won't impact the school culture. If you look at schools that have had a very enthusiastic director who's decided, or school superintendent, that this is what we're going to do in our school, there's also stories that we've seen where it doesn't work. A fully top-down approach doesn't work either. So from my experience and from what I've seen, and from the research actually that came out of the Myriad project, the early part of that, looking at implementation in schools, the way it's been seen to bite and to stay in a school system is totally that bottom-up approach that then gets supported by an enlightened or recently, you know, opened up school leader who says, okay, this is really, we need this in our school. This lady's doing some, I can help her. And then they work together, or other people come into that area for a while. So that is very much at the moment, anecdotally, the way that things develop most satisfactorily. I don't know, like in the UK, they're having projects where they're saying mindfulness is going to be taught in all these areas as part of this curriculum. I'm not sure yet. It's too early to say how successful that is going to be, because again, it comes down to the embodiment of the teacher and the ability to implement that in a really sustainable way. But the tipping point, I haven't seen it that often. There's two schools that come to mind right away. And I wouldn't say it's the school I worked in Prague. We got it to a certain point, but then it was blocked by one part of the school. So we weren't able to embed it as a whole school system. There's a school actually in Edinburgh. It's a private school that was one of the first to start doing the .B training. And it took them 5 years of a few teachers doing this with their students and keep trying to invite other colleagues in and show them ways they could do it for themselves, or get other speakers in. Over a 5-year period, they finally got it on the third or fourth time of bringing in some MBSR trainers, that actually it began to bite with the staff. And from then it really took off. It hit a critical majority of teachers who felt for themselves internally that this impacts the way that I live and teach. And it began to become part of the culture of the school. And the schools that I know that have embodied this most, well, there's one in Phuket we could talk about, but I'm really thinking of, in the USA, the Middlesex School in Massachusetts, where our colleague Doug has been, because there's somebody, Doug, who came in and really started mindfulness teaching. It was seen by the school leader as a really important area, and it's virtually become the defining feature of the school. It's now got to such a point that they can train other schools. They've started a program to help bring mindful well-being directors into other schools in the USA and to help sponsor that. It's got some backing. It's become quite a successful example of how it can permeate the whole culture.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bruce, I saw your comment in the chat. It's quite an interesting one. Maybe you want to share it publicly and share a little bit more about what you wrote.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk, Kevin. I found it very interesting. Just before I go on to the wider topic in answer to your question as to what Mind and Life could do, just the conversation you've just had with David there, I'm so sorry that Catherine Weir isn't here with us today, because she's undoubtedly the expert on this within the UK. She was part of the setup for the Mindful UK government initiative, and she did address us at ESRI, Mind and Life ESRI, I think in 2015, when she said that she went into the schools to look at mindfulness, and she came out realizing that compassion was the most important factor. And I think it's important when we talk about what we're introducing, that we look at both mindfulness and compassion. And in those parts of the world where they're not very happy with the Buddhist terms, we look at perhaps what we are trying to explore, which is self-awareness and self-acceptance, which is my own personal definition of profound self-compassion. The other thing that she did say was that it was impossible to go directly to the students. The only way that you could introduce change was through teachers who had already embodied the changes that needed to be taken. So I think that reinforces the fact that if you want to introduce anything in schools or in universities, you have to go through the educators, and the educators actually have to want to make the changes. Now, the comment I posted is something that I've discussed before at various Mind and Life summer research institutes, both in Garrison in America and in Germany and elsewhere. And this is the idea that, yes, we want to change things for our children. We want to give them a chance to have their own worldview based on acceptance of themselves, belief in themselves, and this is the potential source not only for them to be happy in the world that they're growing up in, but also will undoubtedly have the possibility of changing the world to what they want rather than what we feel should be imposed on them. And I've made the point before that if we are going to educate a generation of children in this way as they grow up, and I think it's probably important to start with the preteens, the 7 to 11-year-olds, before they hit a lot of the problems of the teenage brain growth spurt and problems of emotional peer pressures and nowadays social media. We also have to prepare society to accept a generation growing up with a different worldview, and that can be very hard to do. So it is our responsibility not only to be looking directly at educating our children, but we also have to educate parents, society, governments to be prepared for children coming out with a different viewpoint. And perhaps a perfect example of this is the resistance to little Greta's speaking out in the area of the environment. As a rather elderly member of the community, I grew up in the 60s as part of that baby boomer generation, who actually did change their viewpoint. There was a change in society from a hierarchical educational system to one of wanting compassion and love and a peer-to-peer change. It met with an awful lot of resistance, but for my generation, we actually did effect change, probably just because of the sheer weight of numbers and the fact that we have some financial clout, which had never happened for teenagers before. But those changes are a model for what could happen at the present, but they did lead to changes in feminism, environmentalism, gay rights, a whole number of areas that opened up at the end of the 60s and into the early 70s. I would say that my generation perhaps forgot then to pass on the same freedoms that we had to successive generations and have held on to a hierarchical system to our values. And I think it's perhaps time for us to recognize that we also have to pass on the baton to a new group of teenagers and give them, having given them the tools to create a worldview, we have to respect that and educate the adults and politicians in society to accept that. I put a link up there if people are interested. I was involved personally with the Irish government, and this is my point as where Mind and Life can influence that society to effect perhaps some of the top-down changes to go in parallel with the bottom-up changes that you and David were talking about. And a colleague of mine from Mind and Life International, Dr. Dan Siegel, a psychiatrist and a medical colleague of mine, came with me, and we addressed the Irish Parliament, or a group from the Irish Parliament, on how these changes could be made. I then worked with the Oireachtas Education Department, sorry, the Irish government is called the Oireachtas, the Education Department of the government, and we created a program of TED Ed talks, which are available on YouTube. And the particular one which I've given the link to is one I worked with a 16-year-old who'd never spoken in public before, but had been affected by peer teenage suicide and wanted to know what we could do. And we worked through the possibilities, and he gave what I think is quite an impressive 8-minute TED Ed talk, looking at the potential to make changes and what he genuinely believed could happen. And if anybody's interested, they could have a look at that link. But that's one way in which members of Mind and Life can approach the overall problem, whilst other members of Mind and Life, like yourself and Catherine Weir, are attempting to introduce the bottom up. So I hope I haven't gone on too long, but that was just what I raised.
Thank you.
I see a question from Mark in the chat as well, but before that, I want to maybe add a little question to what Bruce has just shared, and also to reshape the question I raised in the beginning a little bit. I have 3 daughters attending now high school and primary school as well. And they, as you mentioned, Kevin, face and see the reality of climate change and lack of meaning in society, in life in general. And what I observe in them is that there is a growing sense of anger. Anger in the sense of wanting to do something with it, a deep motivation inside their souls to resist the way adults shapes or form societies these days, and to come up with alternative solutions. And you can see that voice of, I mean, of course, it's a positive voice of anger in Greta Thunberg's statements as well, that she shares in public and in big government gatherings or UN gatherings. How shall we approach this form of urgency and this form of anger in their character, in their mind, especially in light of what Bruce has just said, that it seems we want to transmit our model and our paradigm to our children, but they may be developing a different paradigm, a different model, how they want to address the challenges they face. And I'm not sure whether I, as a parent, as a father, am aware of the complexities and the depth and the differences of the approach that my own daughters are developing.
It's like maybe Bruce wanted to come in on that right away.
Thank you. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but if we bring it back to the mind, we must understand that the mind-brain is actually designed for survival, not for understanding itself. And the important survival mechanisms are fight, flight, and freezing, which I think we all know. However, survival is no longer based on the individual. It's now based within society. And as fight, flight, and freezing become social mechanisms, we can recognize that dysfunctionally, fight can become anger or hatred, flight can become anxiety, and freezing can become depression. So once we recognize that as social mechanisms based on fear and the need to survive, we can start to understand the reactions of our children. Now, and of course, adults, I mean, this is the reason why anxiety has gone through the roof during the pandemic over the last 18 months. It is a survival mechanism of society. As Kabor mentioned, so is anger. So these are, you know, there is more to this than just developing, this generation is reflecting the fact that they fear for their survival in their basic responses. Do we give them the tools to help them work out where they should be with their survival, or do we just stir the pot and leave them with their anxiety, with growing mental health problems, increased teenage suicides, and as a consequence, a hugely increased, eventually, level of adult mental health problems. So it's hugely important that we reflect their fears, and this was part of the reasoning and behind the program that I went into, and which this TED-Ed talk addresses. I would urge people to have a listen to it, because it starts off with teenagers actually stating the problems that they recognize and then looking for a solution. And the solution that we came up with is not the obvious one of more treatment, response to the problem after it's happened, which is the current response and has been over the last 18 months. This was to move to an earlier stage to prevention, to provide children with the tools to be able to cope with their responses to the survival pressures.
Kevin, I would be curious to hear what you would add to these points Bruce made or
Yeah,
made.
I mean, it's a great question again, isn't it? And I kind of delight in the anger of people like Greta Thunberg, you know, the blah, 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 blah. I thought that was just so beautiful that she just brought that adolescent quality to cut through all the crap, basically, so that to get to the point that nothing much is happening. And I'm not an expert, but I understand, some of you will know that in some ways adolescence is an evolutionary adaptation. You know, it was the adolescents who, when human tribes are moving to different areas, it's very often the adolescents that broke the boundaries. Their brains were not so conditioned that they could actually seek out new pastures and find different ways through. So adolescents are programmed to rebel to a certain degree. But we also know from self-awareness and study and research that adolescents don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, so they're not able to fully think through the consequences of actions sometimes. But a combination of empowered adolescents with guidance from wiser elders around them can be very powerful. And thanks to Mark for sharing that quote about thinking, you know, the UN person who used to think that biodiversity and climate change were the problems, but has realized that the problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. You know, one antidote to apathy in your elders is a vigorous, angry, more aggressive approach by young people, which we have to listen to. We totally have to listen to at this stage, because it's right. They are, as Bruce is saying, they're talking about their future, and that anger, to a degree, is what will give them the courage to take steps and to voice their opinions. And it needs to be respected, but also channeled, I think.
Thank you, Kevin. You mentioned Mark's statement and Mark's point in the chat. So Wolfgang, if you don't mind, I would invite Mark to also share what he posted in the chat first, and maybe a question or a comment, and then I would turn to you, Wolfgang. So Mark. Mark, are you still here? I also see your...
Try not to go into my adolescent mind. Since I'm quite connected to the For Future movement and follow basically the implications of Greta Thunberg's initiative, my personal impression is that it's the fundamental change she's really holding and her group. So my impression is she's tremendous contribution. And I just focus on Germany, but actually there's a shift in society where people decide I go with or against. And this awareness, because my question is on awareness actually, to make clear what actually is awareness in the context of mind and life, because we have such a knowledge about the understanding of awareness. And in this crisis, we have such a responsibility to make clear what awareness, the tool of awareness is. And that's why I shared the quote. This weekend, there was the Entrepreneurship Summit in Berlin, and Tanya Singer made the presentation again. And I made a presentation myself also, working in university and actually empowering students to make the change. But I gave this quote because this person is quite special, James Gustav Speed from America. And in his position, he realized that actually science is analyzing, but looking in the wrong direction. And what the research has been done in Mind and Life with His Holiness at this moment is such an importance. We need to use the lobby we have to bring this to the forefront of people in this crucial time. And Greta Thunberg is opening the door. And that's why I'm saying climate crisis, all that it's a kind of consciousness. The question right now, what you're offering tonight, you're offering really so many kind of open ends, and it needs to be gathered in one mind. And one mind, in my understanding, is awareness. If you go into the deeper practice, what has been proven by science, that if you go to a higher conscience, like Frederic Laloux, I was 2016, I was in Brussels when he presented that on the Mind and Life conference. If we increase the consciousness, we have access to other solutions. And so we talk about, we cannot replace the people in power right now, but we can increase their awareness by peer learning. And this is the World Economic Forum. When I talked to the general manager, I asked, what can we do? And he said, train people in peer learning and go to universities and strengthen the corporations that they engage in the movement. And that's what's happening. I'm just trying to ask you now, my question is again, going back to awareness-based, because for tonight, that's my understanding. What is in education awareness-based training?
Yeah.
To make it clear tonight, because otherwise, how to say, we have the knowledge what this actually means in comparison to mindfulness-based.
Yeah, it's a great point, Mark. And I mean, just firstly, the pushing to say, you know, what do you really mean and how do you do that is so important, because in fact, I think that's part of what needs to be facilitated more. There's lots of groups doing similar things and overlapping things, but actually to sit together, to look together and to really share, you know, precisely what is it that you mean when you do this? How do you work with young people or with educators in that way? That I need to get a feel for it, to understand what it is that you're doing and that you understand what I'm doing and what I mean by it. Because from that, we can probably get synergy to grow things between us, and some things would take off in that way, that coming together. So I think that's so important. And for me, awareness-based well-being is a very practical thing that I know what it means for the work that I do with the teachers that I work with. And it's very practical. It may or may not correlate with other people's understanding of doing that. I think the ideas would correlate. So in terms of, you asked about Richie Davidson's 4 pillars, you know, so we build awareness, which I'll come back to. We've already talked a lot about how that can increase our ability to connect with others. So it's connection with the inner self and a connection with others. It's practical connection. And we can become more aware, self-aware, aware of others and the environment around us. So that's gaining insight into the way things work and the way that I fit into that. So there's awareness, connection, insight, and then a purpose, a sense of purpose. Like, why am I doing this job? Why am I in this school? Why am I doing this activity in this classroom at this moment? My question to kids when I went into the class as a principal was always, oh, that's great. Why are you doing that? And very seldom could they tell me anything other than, well, she told us to do it. You know, like it did have a meaning and a value, but the kids didn't often connect it. They didn't see it. So within our sphere of training teachers in the first place, kids is slightly different, but we're building that awareness tangibly through understanding how my emotions work and really using real life practical examples of that. When I'm in a classroom situation and I'm triggered by anger in a situation, what is that like? How do I know what I'm experiencing it? And what steps can I take to manage that? How can I use my self-awareness in a practical way to make a better environment, to not overreact in a certain situation? We will use it in physically learning to be more present. You know, actually using some drama theories and some approaches from that area. How can a teacher really feel and play with being more present in the classroom? Let's try out a few ways in which you can do that in a very practical way. So it's I think awareness is helpful in the sense of not just calling it mindfulness, because you could categorize all of social emotional learning as a raising of awareness, which opens that a broader umbrella. Mindfulness is part of that. It could be the starting. It doesn't matter too much where you start. You know, it depends a bit how you define it. But in our definition, mindful awareness can support those development of those skills. It can also be an end within itself. And what we haven't come back to very much tonight, but it's come up with Bruce mentioning compassion, is the qualities of kindness and curiosity become the themes that we come back to over and over again. How do we build an attentive awareness that is heartful, has kindness and curiosity? And if only those two values are seen as culturally relevant within a school system and within teachers, you stand a chance of increasing kindness and curiosity within that school culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Allow me one concluding remark, please, Gabor and Kevin. Just, I know about the time limit.
Please.
We know about the research with Richard Davis and Cortland Dahl, they're just doing a course also, about there are nine levels of consciousness, and from where 8 are conceptual, and the 9th consciousness is said to be non-conceptual awareness, innate awareness, which has a completely different potential. So when we talk about business, there's the market volume and the market potential. And we're talking about still about mind volume, but we don't talk about the mind potential. And my understanding is actually awareness offers the mind's access to the mind potential, to different ways of solving problems, of completely different ways, which are non-conceptual, which needs, and that's why I want to bring it tonight only in this context. I wouldn't kind of stress the point so much, because also the Vajrayana from the Buddhist, where the Dalai Lama offers contribution, it's like visioning the future, like what Otto Scharmer says, from emerging from the future. In my understanding, what it means, you're visioning out the future to be, which is a Vajrayana practice. And you're using a higher level of conscience where you connect it to the feeling. And the feeling gives you the confidence and courage actually to follow your vision and not your goals. And this is a mindset from coming from a business mindset into actually a regenerative mindset. And regenerating in terms of really saying that the mind reconnects to its fundamental nature, basic goodness. That's just for tonight, because my personal work is about working on system dynamics. And I see the importance of multi-stakeholder approach to let people experience what is called in Tibetan adruption, to live actually an enlightened or aware society, to live it out, to experience that. So thank you for taking the time. I apologize, Kevin. It's amazing what you shared. It was so inspiring, and I will follow up on that in my study I'm about to conduct.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for your questions. And just to say, in a very practical way, when we create that space, because we focus on listening skills a lot, on a deeper listening level, and when we open up that listening to self or to other and to the earth, we are tapping into that sensing area, that presencing area, where rational solutions aren't the only thing available to us. And again, it's a very practical skill that we can train teachers and students in. And it's marvelous. The innate awareness. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Kevin. This was an interesting dialogue, this last part especially. And I would like to ask Wolfgang, still, we have this time for the last question, Wolfgang, or comment or anything you would like to add.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to make it short enough to honor the time. I was, well, it's difficult to summarize, but I'll try about what is it that might help bring about a change in the educational system or in the world altogether. And the points I'm trying to connect are mindfulness and compassion, anger and grief, and learning and tipping points. So there was one, I guess the core of it is that if I hear information about something, for instance, ecosystem collapse and destruction and so on, and I hear the data or the facts about it, and I want to do something about it, it's not as effective as if I feel it very deeply. So in the context of education, for instance, if one purpose of education would be to help children, as you mentioned, anger, for instance, Greta Thunberg and others, to tap into their creative potential, but also the emotions that are already present, then mindfulness and compassion training and all around it would not be to kind of, in the sense, manage anger or grief or other emotions so that they are not showing up, but to create, help create a container in which they can be felt and explored and connected to the aspiration to do good in the world. Help, reduce or harm, clean up the mess, or create a more beautiful world in many ways, and to empower them to find out how it should be done, in the sense that Bruce said before, the older ones, which maybe I'm already or will become soon, also have to then step back and out of the way too, but also need to be able to it's like also in that sense an education for everyone. And these points about anger and grief hold true for everyone, not just the young people. And what might it be that helps make a shift in the hearts and minds of people that we can get in touch to as the Mind and Life community members, for instance, if we're educators or non-educators, if a conversation with anybody who has some influence or no influence, it doesn't matter, if I can get in touch with that person, for instance, connected with such emotions that are present in both of us, and be able to feel that together, then that could be one way to, in a way, pass on a flame or a spark, so that the information about here are ways in which we could change our education system can connect with with some kind of inner fire that the person has in them, but that gets awakened in such an exchange. And one way to share examples of why such an education can be helpful, I feel, has to do with tipping points and learnings. And I say this maybe in the spirit of something that I've heard as learning stories in the Native American context, where it's a story that helps you learn, that contains learning about something that has been learned. So it sounds maybe a little bit convoluted, but a story about how something has been learned, or how some positive tipping point has led to a change, connected with the emotions, but embedded in the qualities of compassion and mindfulness as the container of the exchange, maybe. Sorry, I'm just trying to kind of put all these thoughts together, and I'm not sure if it's really making sense, but I feel like there's something there that maybe everyone can do, even if we're not working in the educational system as such. I hope that makes some sense. I'm sorry, it's difficult to put together.
Yeah, I mean, that's beautiful. And I mean, the energy, the emotional energy you're describing is the energy that drives learning and engaging with the world and change. So the bringing the light to the spark, when a teacher does that with a child, or anybody does it with somebody else, when something that you've got that lights that spark in somebody else, that's that inner illumination that leads to a passion for a moment about that area of learning. There's something intrinsic, and the energy is far more important in some ways than the intellectual capacity to understand the ideas, because it's the energy that takes you through into the next, wanting to find out more. And when you apply it in this way as you are, in terms of driving us in areas of dealing with climate change or other difficult areas, even more important, I'm thinking of the work of Joanna Macy and other people, that, it's only when you have to be able to manage the depression and the grief and the despair. It's not, so we have to own it, not control it, but we have to regulate it in a way that we can work with it. So that in that sense of channeling, so that we can, not go crazy while we're trying to do some of this work. And the same for our children. They need it diluted. It needs to be real, but it needs to be in ways that, in packages that they can really work with and appreciate. So I love that the bringing our attention back to the emotional energy and the importance of that, which is also a big need for self-aware understanding how the emotions work. And anger can be helpful and it's a good message, but it also can be destructive if I don't use it in the right way. So understanding how to work with those areas is so key.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the
Thank you
last thing
very
on
much.
that, sorry, just, the research from Japan that you teach kids about the environment, nothing much happens. You give kids a tree to adopt outside their school in the local woods. That is their tree. They have to go and watch and draw every day. They become passionate about preserving that forest because they have that emotional connection.
Thank you, Wolfgang, and thank you, Kevin. I think the framework of our dialogue and the deep discussion around specific topics arose because of your talk, Kevin. The big questions you started your talk with around climate change and the resilience and the issues of mental health. So it was really powerful how you introduced and started the whole context, sharing the whole context of your work, and that led us into these points, into these discussions on very specific questions. And also because this is the time to have these discussions, the climate conference is coming next week. Everyone is hopefully going to talk about that. It's really timely, it's really needed, and this is the time to address these questions. This is the time to address them really concretely and to step up one way or another to offer not only talks, but also help and solutions and guidance, and to live this challenge together with the younger generations.
Yeah.
And to understand their frustration and to be frustrated as well, and to be nurtured as well. So thank you, Kevin, for your talk, for your work, and for your time together this evening. I would like to thank everyone else also who were here with us, who have already left and who are still here. I just want to mention, because Catherine Ware's name was mentioned, she did send us an email that she couldn't attend this meeting tonight. She wanted to, but she had some other activities pre-planned before this event was organized. But she will talk on November 4th, not far from today, very soon actually, about her own really important work that she has come up with recently. Not only her, but she and her colleague through the Mindfulness Initiative in the UK. They wrote a big paper on implementing mindfulness in schools, an evidence-based guide. And she's going to talk about that paper and the findings, and also the learnings that they are trying to implement with this initiative and with the wider context of cooperation between Mind and Life Europe and the Mindfulness Initiative. So we will address these topics in this fall with Catherine, and also we will have another meeting on November 16, again, not so far in the future, with Salah Marit and her PhD student, also talking about some experiences and findings and research they have done recently. So this fall, we are trying to address these important topics around education and the learnings from our colleagues and friends in the wider network of Mind and Life Europe. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin. And
thank you all for organizing this, and setting it and creating this space for us. And thank you for all the lovely comments, and especially to everybody's contributions and being part of this. And I would still want to put back to Mind Life, for the future, to continue, but practical ways of bringing this to teachers, of making it accessible. I mean, there are lots of things happening that are really useful for teachers, but how many people have the time to go out there and find it and open it and find their way to it? How can we bring it to them in more accessible ways? I think that's the big challenge.
Thank you, Kevin, for that suggestion as well, and for the question you raised around that. And this is a really important and meaningful suggestion. And we are working on that behind the scenes. We are trying to reshape and recalibrate and integrate the focus and the scope and the findings of education in the overall scope of Mind and Life Europe and the activities of Mind and Life Europe. And hopefully next year will bring some beneficial results.
Yeah, and we're happy to support that.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you all for participating tonight. And so we will see each other again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin.
Lovely to see you, David. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Gabriel.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.